Thank you for joining us today. New Year predictions are a well-established ritual in our society. And like New Year's resolutions, they're easily forgotten as the weeks turn into months and we find ourselves in a reality that looks a lot like what we've experienced the previous year. And I think that's partly because change doesn't follow the calendar. The new year is an arbitrary conceit, of course, but it's also because real change tends to be more incremental. And this is especially true in higher education. After all, higher ed is notoriously conservative, resistant to change in its very DNA. And for that reason, predictions of change in our field are often greatly exaggerated. The predicted changes don't really threaten the basic ecosystem of higher ed, so much as they're notable exceptions that only serve to underscore the power of tradition and continuity. But is the pandemic the one exception to the rule? Well, if there were ever an exception, this would certainly be it. None of us have ever seen a disruption as profound as the one we experienced this year, as millions and millions of students migrated to remote learning, not slowly over time, but all at once. In a normal year, change is on the margins where there isn't enough leverage to shake the foundation, to shake the core. But this year, the sheer magnitude of disruption is not some distant tremor, but a great shift of tectonic plates, the kind that forms new continents. In other words, what we're experiencing may be a fundamental restructuring of our world that is not incremental, but seismic. Nobody knows the true extent of the lasting impact of the pandemic on higher ed, but if I'm confident of anything, it's this: we aren't going back to the way we were, not entirely anyway, and in that caveat is a world of opportunity. Now that we've put undue pressure on our poor panelists, let me introduce them. We couldn't have chosen a better cross-section of highly attuned earthquake detectors than this group of leaders. Let me begin with our moderator, Goldie Blumenstyk, senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Next is John O'Brien, president and CEO of EDUCAUSE. Also joining us is David Schejbal, who assumed the presidency of Excelsior College this past year after serving more than 10 years in the University of Wisconsin system. David is also a former president of UPCEA. And finally, we have Julie Peller, Executive Director of Higher Learning Advocates, an organization that's focused on public policy and the needs of today's learners. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping issues. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website tomorrow afternoon. We will have about 20 minutes of Q&A later in the session. Please post your questions in the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, it's time to put this in the capable hands of your moderator, Goldie Blumenstyk. Goldie.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. There's a lot of ways we could have gone with this conversation today. In consultation with the panel, we've kind of come up with 5 broad themes. Just going to give you that so you get a sense of where we're headed today. Theme 1, digital transformation. Theme 2, we'll sort of look at the unprecedented economic disruption that's coming to higher education right now and what that means. Theme 3, higher education will play a role in the economic recovery, but what will that look like and what's that going to be like? Theme 4 is really whether and how higher education might play a role in the societal and political recovery that our country so dearly needs right now. And finally, it's 23 hours till there's a new presidential administration in office. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit about what a Biden-Harris administration might look like for higher education, taking a little look at some of the parameters and some of the factors that will come into play. So let's start off with the big one, this year's biggie, digital transformation. I'm going to go to John, who's obviously at EDUCAUSE, has gotten his finger on the pulse of a lot of this. John, higher ed tech and sort of tech in general, it sort of saved higher ed's bacon, at least over the past 10 months. But now what? What are we likely to see in the next year or two? And Julie and David, you don't get to escape this, but we'll start with John.
Well, this is a topic that we've been making a real focus for the last few years, so I will force myself to be super brief and let everybody weigh in as well. You know, we have gone from really digital transformation as this sort of rhetorical flourish, you know, a phrase that has a certain corporate feel to it, right? Not so much higher ed, to you know, in 2018, we had one of our top 10 most read articles was digital transformation, what is it? And we've gone from that to, you know, as Bob said, we've moved mountains. I mean, and it is visually true. I sometimes will use a chart that shows, on the one hand, the number of face-to-face courses before COVID, and then the after, which is the number of online courses. And it literally is moving from one mountain to the other. And I do believe that part of what this transformation that's happening is that I don't think, you know, we are going to be able to go back to the old narratives about higher ed only moves at a glacial pace, because we now know that we can move more quickly. And so it's a question of what do we do going forward? And I believe that what has happened before us bears the hallmarks of digital transformation. You know, number one is that we now all clearly realize that it's not just the technology. This transformation has to be because of the technology, but also because the workforce is changing and the culture has changed. And we've always said that that's what digital transformation is. It's not just cool technology itself. It's not just technology innovation here, you know, what we say in higher ed, pockets of excellence. It's something innovative, but not bottom up, but sort of ubiquitous and throughout the organization with buy-in at the top. And that's what I really do believe we're starting to see. We did a survey in 2019 and the vast majority, 60% or more, said that over the next 2 years, they see digital transformation becoming more and more important. And that was pre-COVID. So I think this is what's happening. I think it's exciting. It's also shining a big light on those who deliver technology services on campus. So that's the EDUCAUSE community. We did a quick poll many weeks ago asking, is IT
playing a more strategic role on your campus? And 2/3 said absolutely, significantly, or greatly. We asked whether whether that sort of influence and strategic role is likely to diminish after the pandemic, and 80% said no. They think it's sort of, it's become a permanent feature. And so we have a moment now to really accelerate, leapfrog, tectonic picture metaphor, but to find a way to really move our institutions from a sort of reluctant use of technology to what we think of as digital transformation, which is part and parcel of using technology, not for its own sake, but to solve sort of the grand challenges of higher education. So I'll pause there and let others get a word in edgewise. Thanks, Goldie.
Great. Julie, what do you, is this the digital revolution, or do you think people are going to be looking to just get back to the way they, back to in-person classes and face-to-face and sort of that, more personal experience?
Well, I think that'll certainly be all over the map. We saw a lot of surveys from a student perspective in the spring and summer of student dissatisfaction with going online. And I think for those who were on campus before, they felt like this wasn't the bargain that they signed up for. I'd be curious to see next spring how students feel. However, it also, we know the digital transformation and why so many have seen the promise of going digital is broadening access and the potential for reaching adult students, working students, students who can't come onto campus on a particular schedule. And I do hope that those parts stay, those parts where that access has broadened, has stayed, but also the learnings of how to reach those students and reach those students well in this environment. Pandemic or no pandemic, those students have needs that need to be met online or in campus. And I think institutions are doing a better job reaching students' non-academic needs online. And if that stays, this very well could be the digital transformation.
That's really a good point. One of the things I heard from so many campuses when I've been talking to college leaders this year is suddenly they've developed the online capability to serve students in a way that they probably should have had for the last 10 years, maybe. They certainly, and now, you know, the question is, I guess, can they afford to keep it going too, right? You know,
Yeah.
That 24-hour, you know, expectation is now going to be there even when students are on campuses. David, what about any of these things you've heard, but also, is this going to lead to some different kinds of models, more hybrid, you think, going forward? I mean, Excelsior is a little bit of a hybrid. Excelsior model is a little bit of a hybrid model already, I believe, right?
Well, Excelsior is 100% online,
Okay.
and has been.
With no in-person?
No in-person.
Okay.
No. We do some nursing assessment in-person work, but generally speaking, our instruction is 100% online. But, you know, going back to the conversation, I think before I went to Excelsior, I've been at Excelsior since August, but prior to that, I was at a very traditional residential Jesuit school. And what became clear with COVID to me were two things. First of all, schools that were not primarily online didn't go online during COVID. They went to a triaged version of distance delivery of content, trying to get it out as best as they could. Going online is a very different long-term game. So that's one thing. The other thing that became very clear to me is that traditional age college students who want to go to a campus aren't paying for education. They're paying for an experience. And when schools went to delivering education at a distance and the experience suddenly halted, students got ticked off.
So,
and the need for finishing schools isn't going away just because schools now can deliver content online.
so I want to pin you down for a second here because we promised predictions. So what do you think this is going to look like in a year?
Well, I think actually the more interesting question is how many schools are going to be left in a year, right? So I think there will continue to be a need and a demand by traditional age students to have a college experience, a finishing school experience. Adults were already taking a lot of classes online. They're going to continue to do that. I think what will happen is that there's going to be a significant culling of institutions, especially small private liberal arts schools.
All right, well, that's where we're going to move to that question next, but it sounds like you don't think this digital transformation that we saw, this digital pivot that we saw this past year is going to last.
Well, I think it'll last in some ways, but it's going to be far more nuanced than what we think. So, for example, we've talked for decades now about backwards design and better ways to design curricula so that students can do the rote part of the academic experience online, and then, excuse me, faculty can actually spend the time in class engaging more with students. Hopefully, one of the outcomes, the positive outcomes of COVID will be that there will be more schools taking advantage of that. There will be more opportunities for students who are sick or who are trying to work and go to school to also not miss classes, but to make them up because they're also delivered simultaneously in a distance modality. So I think the technology will improve access. I don't think it's going to radically change the desire, certainly among traditional age students, to go drinking on Thursday nights and go to class with their buddies.
Okay, a question that might be a good bridge to our next question about sort of the economic disruption to campuses, but did this pandemic kind of open up the playing field to different kinds of players? A lot of us saw a lot of noise from places like Coursera and edX having a lot more interest. We kept hearing a lot about students going to sort of looking for shorter alternative kinds of credentials, not necessarily traditional credentials. Is this going to be a moment where students, maybe not traditional students, but maybe more what Julie would call today's students, older students, are looking for alternatives to traditional colleges, and is that going to last? that's one for all three of you.
I thought where you were first going was different tools, and I don't know a lot about this, but I have some reason to think that OPMs may be having a sort of a different moment, and maybe are revisiting some of their traditional models, and maybe that's a new area.
In what way?
Well, that had to move so quickly. I don't know that the traditional sort of pricing model is. I think there may be that model may be opened up somewhat. I can't really say more because I don't know more. It's just more what I've been hearing from different institutions. I mean, when they, especially sort of the residential, you know, that really pride themselves on being residential campuses, and to go from where they were to where they needed to be in very quick time. I think that was sort of a trend that I've seen here or there, but we don't have data on it sort of in an overarching way.
Yeah, and we've also heard this term called OPX, which is, I guess, a different idea of the online program. Maybe they're not completely the manager. Maybe they're doing just one piece of the online program. They're not doing the whole packages. Well,
that's what I've been hearing. Like I say, different models from the original sort of OPM idea.
Julie and David, did you see, do you think the roles of some of these alternative providers is going to shake up the finances of colleges or shake up the nature of colleges?
Julie, go ahead.
So to me, this is tied up and actually our kind of conversation about the road to recovery. I think that there is a desire and a possibility, and what it'll hinge on is how those other credentials are valued by employers as people are trying to get back to work. If those are credentials where you can go into a shorter term program and come out with something that you can get back to work with, or you can take into further education as a next step, that seems like it'll be an interesting moment for it. That varies a lot by industry and a lot by location. And so I think the jury's a little bit out to tell on that, but that there's a possibility if employers say, yeah, we need somebody and we need somebody more quickly than a degree pathway would allow for.
David, anything?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead, David.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's these predictions as to, are we going to suddenly have way more online courses? Probably in some places. Are we going to suddenly have more hybrid? I think that's true at many places. But I think maybe one of the more subtle changes that can't be underestimated is just all eyes are now on this online student experience. And I think the expectations that students are going to bring, even to campuses that, as I say, pride themselves on being residential, that's going to be a really monumental change. Michael in eLiterate had an article called Online Student Experience as the New Climbing Wall. And I love that. But I don't think that's going to be optional anymore, because both of what students expect, and also, frankly, because all of us have suddenly our expectations for what we can accomplish online have changed a lot.
Okay, so that is probably a good segue, because to this next conversation that we want to have about the economic disruption that colleges are going to be facing, because even an online student experience has costs, maybe probably costs a lot more than a climbing wall. David talked about the fact that we might be losing a good number of colleges over how many, David, what's your time frame? How many colleges, how do you think we're going to, not even ask you to count how many colleges, but like, when are we going to start to feel the impact of this, do you think, first of all? I think it's good to have a sort of a time frame of a window here.
Well, I think we're starting to see the impact now, and it's going to continue certainly for the next couple of years. Now, a lot of depend on whether the Biden administration tries to bail out higher ed. Right now, there's money coming to higher ed from the federal, from the U.S. Department of Education. So how long schools will be able to limp along with that, I don't know, but it is limping along. When I talk to colleagues who are presidents or provosts at small private liberal arts schools, very few are doing well. And some are literally living paycheck to paycheck. And so, or semester tuition to semester tuition. So I think for a lot of those schools, the future is not bright.
And we don't really have an expert here on state budgets, but I covered state politics years and years ago for the Chronicle, and I follow it still. That's going to be a really dire situation. I mean, there's not really direct bailout money coming for the states right now. Every state economy has been battered, and except for the states like California, which seem to have a little bit of money, maybe just because stock prices are high up in tech stocks, and they make a little money off of that. Public colleges, I think, are going to get squeezed. I think we're going to see a lot more on the mergers and, you know, program closures. But John or Julie, any thoughts on kind of how you see that playing out and affecting students and programs?
Just to bring it back to your comment before about, or question about shorter term programs or alternative credentials. For a long time, we've thought about those as the Coursera's and the edX and something outside of institutions of higher education. I think particularly for larger campuses, we might see some of them trying to bring those types of programs onto campus, like we've seen the executive master's programs as both a way to bring new students onto campus and new revenue lines onto campus. Perhaps there'll be a pressure on the other end to bring certificate programs, certification programs, some of those shorter term things online into as a traditional, under the banner of the traditional campus, rather than as something out there.
As an economics, as a student strategy and as a financial strategy.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
I'll just say that, we've been predicting the demise of higher ed now for a very long time, and who knows what will happen. I would also say, though, that I think it'll be really interesting to watch, not mergers and consolidations, maybe not clearly one or the other, but look at what's happening in Pennsylvania, for example, and look at how we might use technology finally to achieve efficiencies and things that could be the part of the solution that keeps some institutions going during this difficult time.
Mm-hmm. One other question I guess I wonder about is whether we will see more collaborations. It's the thing that, I mean, unless they're sort of forced, they almost never seem to happen, and even in the most logical places. What do you think this circumstance will finally push more colleges to collaborate on shared degree programs and shared,
Yeah, so here I think there are tremendous opportunities, and we are currently in conversations with 8 other institutions, anywhere from big R1 schools, flagship campuses at states, to tiny little liberal arts colleges, to talk about how we can partner. One area to partner, for example, is in sharing curriculum. Excelsior doesn't have an education program, but we have very strong health sciences programs. Other schools that we're talking to focus on education, but they don't have much in health sciences, or maybe they don't have much in the grad space or something like that. So I think curricular collaboration, there's a huge opportunity there. The other place is that I think more and more institutions that have capacity are going to want to move into the OPM space for other schools. That's already starting to happen. The paradigmatic examples are places like Grand Canyon, right, where you have the Grand Canyon Education is the OPM for the Grand Canyon University, or Kaplan and Purdue. But I think we're going to start seeing that a lot more at the traditional space.
What about what I'm concerned about, I guess, is sort of a big divide that's going to, there's always a have and have nots, and not just among students in higher education, but among institutions. And it seems to me this is the kind of financial circumstances that's going to really further that divide. We're going to see a lot more institutions in a position to take advantage of that position, and a lot more that are going to become the victims of it, I guess.
Well, I think in that regard, it's going to be kind of the business model, the typical business model, where you've got the schools that are doing well and the schools that aren't, and the schools that go out of business.
So, again, and anyone else want to kind of come in and kind of give us a window? When do I know we're starting to see some of this right now, but do you think we measure this in a matter of over the next 2 years, we'll start to see this? Or you know, I guess, is this just a deep trough and we'll see who comes out of it after 2 years? Or is this the start of something that goes on for a long time?
Well, the comment I made about predicting the demise for some time, there was something in chat about saying more. I mean, before COVID, I think everybody was predicting the demise would be the great enrollment cliff of, 2025 or whatever it's been refigured to be. I think this is, maybe we'll survive this just in time for the enrollment cliff to hit. I mean, it's going to be one thing after another. So I think it's going to be a tough 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years. Julie?
Of course, for me, a lot of it comes back to policy and what the federal government does. But that continuation of stimulus, I think, has a lot. We're hiding or not seeing a lot of the true effects right now because of that. And so it'll depend on in the next year if this Congress and the Biden-Harris administration continue to support that. I think once that goes away, we'll start seeing a pretty dramatic set of mergers or closures.
One thing worth noting, I think also, I guess it sort of depends on the willingness of the institutions to make a change, because I mean, this past year, I've heard the biggest cheerleaders for small colleges stop cheering for the first time ever. The people that I always think of as saying, oh yeah, we've heard this story before, we'll come back. They're not saying that this year. But on the other hand, it seems like if there are institutions that are willing to make a pivot, it might be a dramatic pivot and it might be too strong a pivot for some places to handle, but there is plenty of need out there for higher education. It might not be in the traditional audiences. So let's shift a little bit to that next topic. That's a nice segue again to the what role will higher ed play really in dealing with our very, very broken economy right now. Particularly, I mean, it's the K-shaped economy. Most people have seen that. I don't know how to really make a K. Some people are still doing really, really well. A lot of people are really not doing well. A lot of women are out of the workforce right now. It's very much the low-income people, but the fact that it overlaps a lot with low-income people of color is a very big issue in our economic recovery right now. What will higher ed be doing to confront that?
So I'll jump in and start here. I think that higher education traditionally, we've all seen, the enrollments go up in times of economic distress. We're not seeing that right now. But I think with the right positioning, higher education absolutely can play that role. Where I hope that higher education goes is, or post-secondary learning a little bit more broadly goes, is addressing the need for training and the need for kind of upskilling, reskilling, whatever term de jour you want to use on that, to get those who are not doing well back into the economy in the near term. But we're going to see shifts in our economy in the long term of how service jobs are conducted, how retail jobs are conducted, how hospitality is conducted. And that will require longer term training, and higher education, I think, can play a role in making sure the short-term training connects to the longer-term training, and we don't recreate a scenario in which people have to choose shorter, long-term inside higher ed, not inside higher ed, and really get stuck and stop, but have an opportunity to say, I can choose this now and use it again later in higher ed.
John, David?
Well, I want to say this has shown a light on higher ed that we need to address some of our internal work too. I mean, there's no pretending that digital divide is not was something that we recognized in the 90s and then fixed. Even though we kind of stopped talking about it as much, we now realize that that is a crucial gap for us. And I do think that higher ed, by addressing the digital divide in all those respects, is going to be positioned to really make a difference during these crises, and it needs to be addressed. I saw in one of the questions from, I think it was Nori at ASU. I mean, one of the things that I hope could come out of this would be a little bit of that energy that we saw at ASU to sort of reimagine the not just the curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum, but also just the disciplinary definitions and revisit how are our disciplines going to be what we need to get us through, or are we still using the same disciplines we used generations ago?
David, what particular programs do you think are going to really be, academic programs are going to be really important going forward?
Well, I think so. I think the programs that are most likely to be really important are the ones that dovetail with inescapable national and global changes. So, for example, when we talk about climate change, things like risk analysis and risk mitigation and understanding exactly what that means at a global level is going to be critical. Food security and water security are going to be critical. Alternative energy production. Those are all going to be key areas. And so then you can kind of extrapolate from that programs, right? Healthcare is certainly not going away, and the aging of this country and the aging of the global population in general is not going to be stopping anytime soon. So there's going to be more and more need there. So I think those areas are only going to grow. The question is, how do you position an institution in a competitive market space to really be effective?
How do you do that?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's part research and it's part just good guesswork. So, you know, for us, for example, you can do the market research. The problem is that market research is all backwards facing. So you have to assume that the future is going to be just like the past in order for the market to behave the same way. So in addition to market research, I think you really do have to look at these big trends. And I don't think that social justice is a blip. I think these are going to be issues that are going to matter to people, and they're going to change kind of how we look at the world around us, and we're going to need to adjust our programs accordingly. Similarly, regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on, nobody really wants to talk about climate change because it sounds like you can't really do anything about it. But people are really ready to talk about the mitigation impacts, whether it's alternative energy production or whether it's risk, as I said before, or national security or food security or agriculture, pick your poison. There you can make some real impacts programmatically. So again, those are interesting areas. Emerging areas right now, for example, are things like cannabis production, right? Which is actually a really interesting systems program, because you have to look at policy, you have to look at agriculture, you have to look at the marketing side, distribution. It's sort of a really interesting microcosm of a lot of programming that we do.
And Julie, what particular policies, I don't want to get into the Biden part yet, but just broadly, are there some broader policies that colleges will have to be thinking about to make them better and more effective players in an economic recovery?
I think so. There was a question in the chat here about stackable credentials. I think the more policies that institutions, states, and the federal government can do to recognize that students, and particularly in this economic scenario, aren't starting at 18 and leaving at 22 with a degree, never to touch higher education again. The idea of stackability, transferability, how to capture learning that happened before can really, I think, make an institution or a program very attractive to a potential student who says, I have some credits I took before the pandemic, or here's what my job was. How can I, take a prior learning assessment or come in as a competency-based model to show what I already know and learn where I need to learn, will be very attractive to this new kind of student and in the economic recovery.
I think it was folks at the Education Design Lab had come up with this sort of image of higher ed as like sort of this more of a flowing loop, like we need an image of it that sort of reflects the swirling student that goes through. One broader trend I just want to raise also about the economy that I've been hearing about from particularly the Southern Regional Economic Education Board is, Julie, you hinted at this a little bit also, it's just broadly automation. The number of jobs that were already going to be eliminated is probably going to be accelerated because of the pandemic. A lot more companies have become a lot more automated over the past year, and that's really going to only accelerate it and create a lot of very dire economic circumstances for a lot of families around the country. And that's another place where higher ed's going to have to sort of pay attention to. I think would add that to one of your trends, David.
Goldie, I was gonna, that was what I was getting at in part when I said we need to look at different curriculum because, and I'm thinking of the great book Robot Proof, where Joseph Aoun talks about sort of retooling a curriculum for this new artificial intelligence ubiquitous world where certain jobs are going to be threatened. And so how do we make our students successful in that world? And I would hope we would start to see curriculum sort of moving toward reconsideration in those kinds of directions, like you say.
Right. Let's talk about the, David sort of gave us a little entryway for that with the with talking about social justice. We've got some big political and societal scars, and well, they're not even yet scars. They're still wounds right now that our country is facing. Obviously, it's not just higher ed's problem to deal with this, but certainly higher ed has a role to play. Where do you see higher ed being actually most effective over particularly in the next year or two, in starting to address some of the I don't know what else to call them, fissures in our democracy, fissures in our society? No one's jumping up for that.
Well, I mean, I'll jump. So here I'm really concerned. We often ask these sort of big questions about, so how can higher ed fix the country, right? Pick your fix. And I think that unfortunately, because higher ed, like all other industries, is an extremely fragmented, competitive environment, it's very difficult without broad national leadership for us to make a collective impact. When I think about when was higher education leveraged to make the biggest impact on this nation, it was with the GI Bill after World War II. There's no question about it, right? And in any measure, by any measure, it was a resounding success and
actually
completely transformational.
Not by every measure, because there was a lot of racism that was still never really addressed underneath the GI Bill, and it was not an even effort. It worked very well for white people. It didn't work as well for Black people. Black service members coming out of the military did not benefit nearly as well. It's important to note that.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. But first generation Americans, Jews, people who before World War II were cut out of higher education, all of a sudden were able to come in. So yes, I agree with you. It did, for people of color, it didn't do as much as we would have hoped, but it sure did a lot for a lot. And but we don't have a national policy when it comes to leveraging these social goods. And we've stopped thinking of higher education as a social good 40 years ago. We think of it as a personal investment in one's own future, one's kids' futures. And it's very difficult to have transformative impacts when we think of it as just a personal investment into making more money.
Do we, Julie or John, do you see any change in that sort of thought about higher ed as more than just a personal ROI?
So I have two thoughts on that, connected to also your original question about social justice. I agree with David's point of without kind of national leadership on this measure, it's hard to see the collective impact. However, I do think there's a lot campuses can do, and where the social good, I think, comes from is talking about student success and talking and being willing to open up higher education's own wounds about how the GI Bill works well for white GIs, but not GIs of color, and how that rings true for a lot of campuses and programs that we think are world-class are working for their white students or their high-income students, and not as well as for their students of color or their low-income students. And so starting to tease out that data and sitting with the discomfort of looking beyond the averages, I think can move both individual campuses as well as national conversations pretty far. It's hard to say that we're not doing well, but I don't think until higher education recognizes where students are being left behind, it'll be hard for us to move together in a collective social place towards success for those students.
I'm glad you said that, and I'm just putting in chat a piece that Ted Mitchell and I wrote on there's tremendous work that we have to do, and I think before we save the world, we need to look at ourselves very, very carefully and thoughtfully. I think I was thrilled to see all the statements of great support, both recently and then with the racial injustice. But our theme at EDUCAUSE for the coming year is figuring out how we can move beyond statements. I mean, higher ed, we're all great talkers, but I think we're moving into a sense of urgency around doing more than talking really effectively about it. And again, when you look at the numbers in the article I shared, it's discouraging, and we're not in a place where we have figured this all out.
Okay, so we're going to hit our last theme now in a minute, but I'm going to invite everyone in the audience to, if you haven't posed the question yet, feel free to put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, sorry, and we'll get to them in a minute. But let's, as I said, it's now, I can't do the math, but it's now like 22 hours and 40 minutes, whatever. The new administration is about to begin. What will matter most in a Biden-Harris administration? What will we see coming from that administration that will have the biggest impact on higher ed?
Well, I got to tell you, the biggest impact that any administration can have is the regulatory space. And I doubt very much that the Biden administration is going to mess a whole lot with the regulatory space. So it'll be interesting to see if the HEA is reauthorized, and if so, if there are any significant changes, or if they're basically going to just limp along with what we've had for a long time. Because if the law doesn't change about how Title IV is allocated, then it's status quo. And we're all going to be living under the same rules.
And I've seen some people say that they don't expect at least in the first couple of years, and maybe not more, a kind of a big sea change, although I think we'll see some reversal of the Trump era deregulation. Some of those regulations will come creeping back.
I think we've moved from a one vote difference on one side to a one vote difference on the other side in the Senate. I think that's going to have a real muting effect on dramatic change. One thing no one's mentioned yet, though, I think we will see a move toward some regulations around accessibility, because that's been kind of stalled I think in the House or Senate, I'm not sure, maybe both, but we've been certainly working on that and watching that, and that's something that I think we do expect some movement on. That's
big, actually. Julie, what do you think?
So I used to say I left my crystal ball at home, but now I work from home. So I left my crystal ball at the office, I guess. Though I do see, from the administrative perspective, I wouldn't be shocked to see some regulatory movement, particularly around student protections, some of the return to the Obama era program integrity rules and conversations. I think we'll see a lot of similar faces or similar policy backgrounds, and sometimes people are politics, and that matters. In Congress, I agree. I don't think we'll see an HEA reauthorization, although I don't think that means Congress will be silent on higher education policy. As we've seen in the waning days of 2020, there was perhaps the most significant federal policy change in higher education and a stimulus bill in the last 10 years, we'll say, in a stimulus bill. And I can see moments like stimulus, like conversations about recovery, conversations about budget reconciliation, appropriations. There are many vehicles that I think Congress will look to, and will look to include some key higher education conversations that we've been having, like access to short-term programs in those vehicles. And so I agree, HEA is unlikely to happen, but A lot of higher ed policy historically happens outside of the HEA, and I expect that to continue to do so.
Well, just to be really clear about this, because this is an important point. So interpretation of the law can happen at the department level, and they can sort of nibble at the edges, but unless you change the law, which is something that nobody can do but Congress, then the HEA isn't going anywhere.
No, but I think what Julie's referring to is we've just seen FAFSA simplification, some other changes to the way that that income is being reported on the FAFSA and some other stuff that it's actually quite remarkable. It will make a very big change, and you could do it as part of a different bill.
Yeah,
Goldie, one regulatory, or I think actually there's going to be laws that I think is relevant to this group is, I think we're going to see some, a lot more around surveillance, privacy, use of opaque algorithms and that, and I don't know that it's going to be directed at higher ed, but it's certainly going to have an impact, you know, sort of our own ongoing GDPR kind of thing. And remember how that was, wasn't aimed at higher ed, but it certainly affected us. So I think that'll be something too.
Yeah, and that's probably more from Congress than from the Biden-Harris administration, but the big tech, the focus on big tech, right?
Oh, there's that too, yeah.
Yeah. I guess the one thing I would add to this whole list is the bully pulpit again. You know, I've worked at the Chronicle for a long time, and every year there was a State of the Union address or another big speech, we'd always have someone paying attention, like what's the president going to say about higher ed? Honestly, we haven't had that assignment for the past 4 years because it was, I mean, not to be snarky, but it hasn't come up. Except to take a shot at higher education, there hasn't really been a policy position coming out of this White House related to higher ed, except usually if it's just been a criticism. I think that will, personally, I think that will change. I expect to see that change in this administration, and you know, clearly on community colleges and some other things too.
Right. I think that's Goldie, just to put a point on that, you know, I think not only will that change and we'll start to see some of that bully pulpit, but to talk about higher education a little bit more broadly than we've seen from prior administrations. You know, I think the influence of Dr. Biden, as well as some of the key appointments, not only at the Department of Education, but the Department of Labor, to think about community colleges, the continuation of training to education, adult students, working students, will be a different tone and tenor than we've seen before.
Right. Bob came back on, and I think that's our good clue to, we should go to our questions now, because I think there've been a couple of good ones in there. Bob, I'm going to let you sort of, I think you've been monitoring the questions, and I'm going to let you kind of come back in here and put a,
Right, there's good ones. Let's start with a question from Cyrus. He noted that Cal State's system has announced a mostly face-to-face return to campuses in the fall, and certainly if you're joining this webinar, that's one prediction that it has become a parlor game for all of us, right? What are people, when are we going to come back? And what are the factors? So what are the nuances there? So who'd like to address that one? What are your predictions for fall in terms of face-to-face?
Well, so every school that has dorms is going to be doing everything it can to fill them up. That's my prediction.
I second that as well. I don't know if that our earlier conversation about hybrid classwork, I think more online or hybrid classwork will continue, but we may see more students sitting in their dorm room taking their online coursework rather than sitting at home taking their online coursework.
I mean, I guess it depends on how much safer. I mean, in many cases, let's hope it depends on how much safer it is, right? It sort of depends on how many jabs in the arms we get between now and August.
I would tend to think that by fall, there will be a preponderance of institutions trying to move back to recovery with face-to-face. I think the obviously open question is these variants and mutations, and to the extent that is going to, you know, move us way back. I think that's an open question right now.
Another question is from Steve Vanden Abend, and it's a very good one. What will there be a different relationship between the administration and accreditors? Are we ready for some kind of sea change there?
You know, the Obama administration made life for accreditors pretty miserable. So I'm not sure that the accreditors are excited to go, you know, in that direction. Certainly, it's hard to see where the Biden administration is going to go. I agree that they're probably going to be more on the regulatory side, certainly more so than the Trump administration. But whether they're going to spend a lot of energy on higher ed in general, tough telling. They've got a much bigger fish to fry right now, as we all know.
Oh, there is. Good.
I think a really big point, kind of crucial moment in that relationship will be this conversation about mergers, closures, acquisitions of campuses. That's a really a place where both accreditors and the Department of Education come to the table together for critical conversations, and those can go well or those can go not very well. And that how that happens can filter out, I think, into other relationships and conversations between the two.
And from what I've been hearing also, it'll sort of, the key to that is also about student protection. People will want accreditors to play a bigger role in making sure students are protected and not getting ill-served by what's happening, to go back to some of our other themes, what's happening with some of the economic disruptions on campus and maybe some of the other re-regulatory issues that are going on. But I think student protection, I think, is going to be the guiding principle for whatever new regulatory efforts there are.
Hey, Goldie, that reminds me of something I was wanting to say earlier, and it's a prediction sort of in between all of these, and that is I think we're going to really see students at the center way more. I mean, that's been a process that's been happening, but I think we're going to start to see that really rise, and I hope that the rise of students, you know, and that's going to come about because if it's true that higher ed's going to be struggling, you know, there's going to be fewer students, they're going to be fighting over them, then it's going to put the students in the catbird seat. And I think students are going to be expecting us to be more responsive to them. And so I think that plays into this whole adding more flexibility in delivery, adding more adult education and more credit for prior learning. And some of those things we've been talking about, but as a whole hasn't been sort of universally adopted.
Yeah, and another piece of that, honestly, is like the definition of what student needs are. I think that's been broadened immensely over the last year as we've been able to sort of zoom into people's, you know, bedrooms and living rooms and sort of see the conditions that many students are trying to go to school under. I think there's going to be a greater government recognition of students, you know, food needs, home security needs, and hopefully digital needs as well.
Absolutely.
But that definition has broadened, and I think that's not going away. Bob, do you have another question from the audience crowd here that you want to bring up?
Well, there is one about free college. We know that was brought up during the Trump administration. There's going to be a more sympathetic group in leadership in Washington now. Where does that go? Is it viable?
So I do think that there will be at least an attempt. It'll be on the agenda. I'll go that far. It's something that the incoming administration has supported, that both the majority in the House and the Senate have supported, but it's a big sea change policy. It's a big, expensive policy. And there are a lot of details that still need to be figured out, like how to deal with adult students or working learners. And so I think there's still a lot of conversation to be had, and it's not shelf ready perhaps, but there's going to be a lot of pressure to make it shelf ready and to push it forward, I think. I also think that means there'll be a lot of compromise at the end of the day.
It's also worth noting that Bernie Sanders is now the chairman of will be the chairman of the budget committee in the Senate, and he's Mr. Free College. So,
yep.
My personal prediction, with no inside information at all, and not EDUCAUSE position, I think where it's going to maybe fall out is going to be expanded Pell eligibility to make the first year of college free to the neediest students. But that's just totally a prediction, as much a guess as anything.
First 2 years is my prediction.
First 2 years. I agree. I agree. With some state partnership, some state money is going to have to be in there as well. But yeah.
Let's bring this a little bit closer to home for those of us, for most of us on the call today who are UPCEA members, who are leaders in continuing education, professional continuing education, and online. Our members are roughly about 50-50 in terms of where their revenue is coming from between online and more traditional professional continuing education. Where's that heading? Some of the folks who were asking about that, Lisa Verma and others, were asking about really where things are headed with alternative credentials, but also modality. Obviously, David mentioned that folks who, adult learners, have really migrated entirely to online even before this. A lot of them have anyway. What about today's learners? Julie, to you as your term and the new term of art that's emerging, today's learners. Where are they going to go? We're not talking about the residential students who will, have pick a course that is online, maybe among their 5, they might have 1 or 2 that are online. But what about the non-residential students, and where are they going to be post-pandemic?
Well, I'll invoke Goldie's writing, which I think has been fine, on the sort of mega universities, as there are certain providers that have been growing and doing a lot of things really well. And I think that, to me, that's an open question to the extent that we're going to see another wave of growth there.
I'm trying to watch David's face to see how he reacts to that.
It's trying to be provocative here.
Well, I was going to shout out to David, as I think we'll see students being attracted to many more programs like Excelsior's that have different non-traditional, I always put those in air quotes because I think it's evolving, modes of learning and delivery will just continue to be more attractive to today's learners, and will not be as, will be more recognized in the employer marketplace, which will only further the cycle of the growth there.
I've drawn some ire from some people by suggesting that I have my doubts about some of the value of these employer paid tuition programs, not because they aren't great, and I don't encourage, I encourage them, but I just think the kind of layoffs that we've seen over the past year, that it's not a reliable source. I don't know what the other 3 panelists say about this. Do we think, and Bob, feel free to jump into, do we think employer paid is a model to rely on going forward?
No.
I think they're hard to scale.
Agreed. I think that they can have a lot of impact at the regional or a local level. But when thinking about a national moment of scale, it's a tool in the toolbox, but is not the only or the biggest.
That might be a useful warning for people to think about. I still hope companies continue to do that, because I think it's, important, but.
Well, and a version of that might be whether we're going to see another energized wave of sort of looking at micro-credentialing. We talked about stackable credentials earlier, but I think the idea of micro-credentials may also get a new life.
I continue to write a lot about micro-credentials, but I've only seen very few examples of where places are producing specific credentials that are valued by the market, and the market is responding by rewarding those credentials. There's an example here in DC called CoLab, which created a digital credential, digital, strategist, I think it's called, or something like that. But I haven't seen a ton of these, self-created credentials that carry a lot of weight versus industry certifications, which I think are, when they're embedded into a curricula, they are established and recognized. But I guess I still wonder a little bit about this micro-credential phenomenon.
Well, with that, Goldie, I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. This was a terrific session, and I'm so grateful to everybody on the call today for joining us, and all those who joined the webinar with us across the country and beyond. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.